I'm Dr. Lauren Sparks. I'm a doctorally trained nurse practitioner. I'm also a therapist. Most importantly, I've walked through the fire of erythromelalgia. My root cause was chronic inflammatory response syndrome. I want you to know I have hope for your healing, lots of it. Today, I want to talk about navigating the complexities of CIRS with our support people or our loved ones. First, I want to talk about why we can get resistance when we get a diagnosis of CIRS. And then I want to talk about what we can do about that resistance. And this will all be in the context of support people. We will make a future video on how to handle resistance within the medical community itself from other medical providers. Shifting back to support people, though, I want you to know that it is a big challenge. You feel so excited. You feel like you're finally getting at your root cause. You have a reason for your suffering. You have actionable steps, and your loved one is misbelieving the diagnosis. They've done a quick cursory search on the internet, and they find that CIRS isn't traditionally accepted within the wider medical community. How do you begin to handle this? Well, it's likely you also had your own questions, and you answered those questions as you came upon the diagnosis. So I think it can be nice to reframe this sort of resistance as typically coming from a good place. Our family members are typically advocates for us. They've probably seen us navigate many paths on our healing journey, and they just don't want us to waste time, money, resources, energy. And so that is where this resistance is often coming from. First, let's talk about within the wider medical community why this disease process isn't more widely accepted. It's not something that we learn about in our medical education. Many of us that are medical providers that treat this disease process had what I would call a baptism by fire, either ourselves or we had a loved one that experienced this diagnosis. And so that's actually how we learned about the diagnosis itself. Unfortunately, we cannot diagnose something that we don't know exists, and we cannot diagnose something that we don't look for. And so it makes sense why loved ones are confused. You've seen 10, 15, 20 doctors. You've been to the meccas of Mayo and Cleveland Clinic, and now you're getting a diagnosis. Why didn't these other medical providers provide this diagnosis? But the reality is the vast majority of these medical providers are likely not aware of the diagnosis, and they have not run the lab work to prove the diagnosis simply because they aren't aware of the diagnosis itself. There are some people, medical providers within the medical community that provide a lot of resistance or pushback against this disease process. And I think it is because it's a confusing disease process. We see it manifest in numerous bodily systems. Unfortunately, in medicine today, we've sort of siphoned things off by system. So when we see a patient that has headaches and shortness of breath, and the list goes on and on as far as numerous bodily systems, frequent urination, nerve pain, etc., etc. And there's many different bodily systems involved. Traditionally in medicine, we would send these people to different specialists. And so what begins to occur, especially if you are a young person that's diagnosed with CIRS, is to a medical provider that is not CIRS savvy, you begin to look like a psychiatric patient. They begin to think you're having somatic complaints instead of real disease processes happening within the body. So this is a big challenge because we can begin to be sent into what I call the dumping ground of psychiatry, even though we are suffering in these very real physiological ways. This provides complexity for our loved ones as they are trying to navigate a confusing medical system. What do we do after we have said to our loved one, you know what, I had a lot of questions too. I learned that the vast majority of medical providers are unfortunately not yet aware of this disease process, and so they're not testing for it, and that's why they didn't find it. And I totally get your concerns and questions because this isn't an inexpensive process. And I know that you don't want me to waste resources and energy and effort. If we've had these open-hearted conversations and we're still getting a lot of pushback and resistance from a loved one, I think it can be really helpful to invite them to sit in on our medical visits. They can bring their own list of questions for our medical provider, and our medical provider can then answer those questions instead of us being the one on the hot seat feeling like we need to have all of the answers. CIRS is a confusing disease process. It is incredibly complex. It's why we can't treat it in a 10-minute visit. And so it can be really helpful to have a support person sit in on visits. What if your support person is working really hard and they cannot take off of work to sit in on this visit? You might ask your CIRS provider if you could audio record the visit so that they could listen. And they might prepare a few questions for the CIRS provider to respond to that you could read during that visit. So you've invited them to sit in on medical visits. What else can be done? You can invite them to better educate themselves. You are having to educate yourself. You have likely hopped into the peer-reviewed literature. We'll link a list of that below so you can provide your loved one with a nice, tidy list of current literature. You may have found other resources. One of my favorite resources is the CIRS group. You can find them on YouTube. They serve info up with CIRS info with a side of humor is how I would describe it. They are proficiency partners, so they are well educated, but they also provide CIRS info in these little bite-sized pieces. So it's not as overwhelming as, say, reading numerous research papers. So let's say you've invited this loved one into visits, you have invited them to better educate themselves, you've had these open-hearted conversations about your own questions about the disease process, and still they're being adversarial. They're really questioning whether or not it's a real thing. Is everything that you're doing really necessary? Then I encourage you at that point to become a broken record. Point them back to the things that you have recommended before. You know what? I've invited you to sit in on my medical provider visits and you really haven't done that. So I'm going to ask you to do that again because I think these questions would be better posed to my medical provider. You know, I've really invited you to educate yourself on CIRS. Here's the list of peer-reviewed literature. I've provided some other resources. As long as you are getting your information from somebody who is CIRS savvy, who is a proficiency partner, who is a Shoemaker trained medical provider, I think it's probably good information, and I'm going to support you educating yourself in that way. But right now, I'm going to turn my energy back to my own healing process. I can't spend my energy constantly justifying myself, and I feel like we're kind of stuck in this loop. We can do this in a warm way, in an open-hearted way, without becoming adversarial ourselves. And I think this is going to be the best way to address a loved one who is misbelieving our diagnosis. And then I would encourage you to not only continue to redirect your support person, but continually redirect your own focus back to your healing. This is the most important place that you can be focused. Focus there. I tell everybody, have this hell-bent, unidirectional focus on your own healing, and then let others sit back and watch the beauty unfurl as you heal from this disease process. If you're benefiting from this channel, please like and subscribe. Feel free to add your own tips, tricks, stories about navigating CIRS with your loved ones in the comments. This is a place that we share our hard-won wisdom. If you have a question for me, please post it in the comments so I can make a video specifically for you. Until next time, take good care and hold on to hope.